Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our symposium, Reorganizing Our Understanding of Semantic and Episodic Memory. Before I introduce the speakers, I need to say that unfortunately Charan Ranganas and Signy Sheldon couldn't make it today due to unforeseen personal circumstances. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we have an amazing lineup of speakers and we expect plenty of interesting discussions. My name is Renoult, and our speakers today will be Sarah Peters from McGill University, Zachria from Washington University in St. Louis, Matthew Greeley from the University of Arizona, and finally, Jessica Andrews-Anna, also from the University of Arizona. All right. So the organization for today would be, we'd have a 15-minute presentation, 5 minutes of question for each speaker, and we'll have time for theoretical discussion at the end. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online from Psychonomics live broadcast. If you'd like to submit a question for the discussion at the end, there is a button on the lower right-hand corner of your screen where you can click Ask a Question, add your name and your email, and we try to address this towards the end. All right. So I'll start. So the idea of this introduction is to go back to Handel Tulving a little bit and to the original definition of semantic and episodic memory. Then to discuss a number of reasons why episodic and semantic should be related in the first place. And finally, some discussion of what we know as of today of their neural correlates and how much they overlap. So if you want any more information about the content of my talk, it's in these two publications, a preprint on the historical perspective on Tulving's episodic semantic distinction, and a recent paper in TICS on the neural correlates of semantic and episodic memory. Okay, so the episodic semantic distinction was first formally proposed, described by Handel Tulving in 1972. And I think it's fair to say it's still very much influential in today's cognitive neuroscience. It's stayed more or less in the spotlight ever since. Tulving, what I think is important to remember is Tulving originally explained that the two memory types were interdependent. So the normal declarative memory functioning would be based on their interactions. But there have been largely separate episodic semantic research traditions, so largely separate fields with some notable exceptions. But there have been a resurgence in interest recently in how much they may overlap, how much their neural correlates may overlap, with the idea that maybe the boundaries, the frontiers between these two memory types is not as clear as what we thought they were. And so hence we think it's timely and that's topic of this symposium to try to think about how this dichotomy looks like today. Got a bit of problem with my slide here. So if we go back to Tulving's original definitions, so in the 1972 book chapter, he presents episodic semantic memory as distinct store or systems. But it's interesting to think about that in the original chapter, it doesn't make a strong claim about different memory systems. It presents this distinction as pre-theoretical and essentially at a descriptive level. It's only in subsequent writings that Tulving proposed more strongly that the two systems would be distinct, meaning that one system can operate independently of the other, and they would be partly governed by different principles. Tulving knew, if you go back to his book and subsequent articles, that if this distinction would be controversial and would still keep some controversy, but he hoped that the two systems could be more clearly separated, and it would be more clearly separated based on their neural correlates, and that would be less controversial with that kind of evidence. Going back to the original definition, so episodic memory is defined as a memory system that receives and stores information about temporally dated episodes or events and temporally spatial relation among these events. And there is, in the original book chapter, there is also this shorter definition, memory for personal experience unique events. So as you can see, it's still a definition that many of us would recognize as valid as of today. Whereas semantic memory is defined as the memory necessary for the use of language, a mental thesaurus, organized knowledge a person possesses about words, and their meaning and reference, and relation about them. And there is this idea that semantic memory will not register perceptual inputs, but cognitive reference. So I think if we think about this definition, it's clear that the definition of episodic memory has changed much less than the definition of semantic memory over the year. And for example, the idea that semantic memory does not register perceptual inputs, but only cognitive inputs, stands in contrast to current perspective, the embodied cognition perspective, or the grounded cognition that semantics are grounded in perception and action. And as you saw from the definition, in that view of the time, semantic memory was tightly linked to language and language comprehension. And it's only in his later work that Tulving recognized that even though semantics may be more tightly associated with language than episodic, there would be semantic knowledge that could be acquired without a language. There is not a one-to-one mapping between memory for language and semantics. But I think, as I said at the beginning, Tulving never failed to emphasize in his work that the two system normal declarative memory functioning would be based on their interaction. So why should they be related at all? So just going to review a few theoretical reasons. So I thought it's interesting to go back to Frederick Bartlett and this idea that for Bartlett, any cognitive activity, whether it's perceiving, imaging, or remembering, is an effort after meaning. So all of its cognitive activity have a common goal, try to make sense of the world and to extract meaningful information. And if you think about the function of episodic memory, I think it's not very controversial to say that the goal is to encode meaningful events, whether they are part of temporally extended narratives, and to bind this meaning-carrying information with a unique contextual features, making individual episodes. And the importance of meaning into episodic memory is illustrated by this famous experimental effect. So, for example, the depth of processing, by which we remember much better things that we process deeply, and the fact that we are really, really poor in general at remembering things that are not meaningful. So try to remember meaningless shapes or figures. Another reason why semantic and episodic memory need to be related is illustrated in Tulving's SPI Model for serial parallel independent. And going back to his 1983 book, there is this idea that episodic retrieval typically includes engagement of semantic memory, so episodes have semantic content, and with the consequence that one system can be used to address one system can be used to answer question addressed to the other system. So there is this interaction that comes about based on this. And then in his subsequent articles, Tulving brings about the embeddedness hypothesis that he later calls the SPI model, with the idea that perceptual information is not directly encoded into episodic memory. It has first to be interpreted by the semantic system. So it looks like this. So first you've got a PRS system, the perceptual input, then information can be interpreted by semantic memory system, and finally encoded in episodic memory. Storage happens in parallel, and retrieval happens independently. So you've got a more recent version of this model, for example, Hanson and Gagnepin here, 2010. And with this arrow here linking perception and episodic memory, with the idea that maybe it's possible to encode perceptual information directly into episodic memory. And so what's the evidence for this? So I think the main evidence against the SPI model typically is the evidence from semantic dementia, where there is impairment in semantic memory, but preserve episodic memory. So in fact, if you look a bit closer, there is description of episodic impairment in semantic dementia, especially verbal material, and sometimes the episodic impairment is proportional to the semantic impairment. So I think what's fair to say, it's not clear how much the preserved recognition memory in semantic dementia is supported by familiarity as opposed to recollection. And the other factor is until the very late stage of the disease, there is some preserved knowledge that could be used to encode information into episodic memory, as well as some preserved perceptual information. So the findings from semantic dementia are not totally incompatible with the SPI model, but they may be taken to say that some form of episodic learning may be possible even when the semantic processing is impaired. So I think it's not totally contradictory to, it doesn't totally contradict the SPI model. So if we go back, if we think about more recent evidence and more recent ways according to which we think about episodic and semantic memory, it's striking to see that some of the same theoretical principles and models are used for both types of memory, and notably this idea of reinstatement or reactivation. So for semantic memory, there is this idea that the semantic system is based on a number of distributed features, so semantic knowledge is distributed in the brain, and thinking about a concrete concept is more or less a reinstatement of the type of features, the cortical activation that happen while you would have initially perceived or interact with that exemplar. So very similar to the idea of episodic reinstatement, if you want. So in, for example, for the type of simulation theory of Barsalou, for example, is to bring the exemplar to mind is just to simulate the pattern of activity that you got initially when you perceive the exemplar in the environment. There is often what people call an anterior shift, where conceptual processing is slightly more anterior than perceptual processing, but there is a clear overlap and some blurring of the frontier between perception and memory there. For episodic memory, there is very similar theoretical idea that in addition, successful recollection in addition to the hippocampus involve a reinstatement of some of the cortical region that were first active during interaction, perception of the item. So here illustrated by a task where people successfully remember the names, visual names or auditory names paired with pictures. So very similar type of theoretical framework. And finally, I would like to say a few words about what we know today about their neural correlates. So if we start by the episodic network, there is a set of brain regions that's called the core recollection network. And that's active when we successfully recollect items, and more or less regardless of the task that's used to elicit recollection. So we'll see a picture in a moment, but it has all these brain region, the parahippocampal cortex, medial prefrontal, posterior cingulate, retrosplenial, left angular gyrus, left middle temporal gyrus, and hippocampus. And this network as a whole is sensitive to the amount of information that people recollect and to the confidence that people have in their recollection judgment. And finally, MVPA studies have shown that it's possible to decode recollected content more or less from all this network. So if we go through the Oh yeah, so sorry, this famous recollection network with inferior parietal, posterior temporal, medial prefrontal, etc. So if we do the same thing for the semantic network, there is this set of brain region that's sensitive to semantic processing, similarly across modalities and tasks. And it comprises many of the same regions that are active for episodic memory. So again, parahippocampal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, inferior parietal, posterior temporal. And again, the activity in this network is sensitive to the amount of conceptual processing in a variety of tasks. So here there are some examples like concreteness, number of association, etc. And similarly, there are maybe less studies, but there are MVPA studies showing that you can decode semantic content, conceptual content from this network. So in that particular study by Fernandino, there was no interaction with the region and the decoding ability. It was the same decoding ability across the whole network. So it's still controversial. The function of each of these brain regions in the network, in the semantic network, and by extension in the episodic network is still controversial. It's quite interesting to see that a few investigators have proposed that some of these brain regions may serve as the interface between semantic and episodic memory, such as the parahippocampal cortex, perirhinal, or posterior cingulate. So whatever it means to be at the interface, but compatible with the overlap. And I've put down here, I won't go into detail, but some of the functional roles that people have proposed. And some, for example, the middle temporal gyrus for some represent concrete concept, and for some is cognitive control. And similar for angle gyrus, either domain general or involved in processing combined complex concepts such as fast track or plate jacket. So I think it's interesting to put them side by side to see the striking similarity. But again, seeing similar inferior parietal, posterior temporal, and medial frontal, etc., posterior cingulate. And just going through a couple of exceptions. So of course, if you studies using sequence optimized fMRI have shown that the anterior temporal cortex is more often associated with semantic than episodic memory. But I think it's fair to say that we need more studies of looking at this role in episodic memory. So there are a few studies, autobiographical memory studies, showing that in fact on the temporal pole regions are sometimes more active for episodic than personal semantics or general semantic memory. Recently, the group of McGill has reanalyzed some of their data set, a data set of 136 participants aged 18 to 76. It was what they found for this is that successful recollection of pair associate, so a typical operationalization of recollection, indeed activates the anterior temporal lobe, so compatible with the idea that it may have sometimes a role in episodic recollection too. But we clearly need more studies looking at this. The other exception is the hippocampus. That's more commonly found to be active for episodic than semantic retrieval. But again, there are some exceptions. There are the concept cells nicely studied by, among others, by Rodrigo Quiroga, with the idea that these cells are activated, and including in the hippocampus, by certain entity and across modalities, so certain places or individual across different modalities. And other exception is you get hippocampal activation in semantic tasks for concepts that are either personal or that have some spatial elements. So if you think about furniture in the living room, if you think about where is Paris located, or that kind of thing. So semantic tasks that have some spatial component. And if you look at autobiographical memory studies, there is not often a clear distinction between memories of unique episodic memories and memories of repeated events. So sometimes the hippocampal activation is very similar for unique and repeated events. Okay, so I think a parsimonious hypothesis to illustrate this overlap is that potentially the recollection network doesn't only illustrate a reactivation, reinstatement of perceptual elements, but also of conceptual elements. And the idea that possibly some of this network, or possibly all of this network, would support the reinstatement of semantic processing, the reinstatement of the conceptual processing that was experienced when we first interact with an object or a situation. So again, it may be a parsimonious hypothesis, but we clearly need more studies. And I think one contrast that's really important to look at is looking at recollection effects in relation to the amount of semantic processing at study. And there are not many such studies, but I've listed one here that found that at least for the parahippocampal cortex, recollection effects were stronger when stimuli had been studied in a semantic task as compared to a non-semantic task. So to conclude, there is a close and necessary relation between semantic and episodic memory. And as we said at the beginning, we are much more likely to encode and successfully remember meaningful events. The evidence that we have briefly reviewed suggests that indeed the boundaries between semantic and episodic memory may be more complex than we initially thought. Not necessarily completely contradicting Tulving, because again, Tulving proposed that the normal functioning of the two systems would be interactive, and with the SPI model that episodic memory can have semantic content. So yeah, we are really looking forward to seeing how these boundaries evolve and whether there are frontiers between semantic and episodic memory will become more blurry again, or still more, or that we just come up with a different perspective on remembering and knowing. So thank you very much for your attention. So we may have time for one question before we change speaker. I'm just going to... So during the symposium, yeah, please use the microphone if you want to ask any questions. Okay. So our next speaker is Sarah Peters from McGill University.
Good afternoon. So my name is Sarah Peters. I'm a PhD student in the lab of Signy Sheldon, who unfortunately can't be here today, so I'll do my best to fill her very large shoes. So within memory research, there's a dichotomy that's often made between semantic and episodic memory, as Louis touched upon, and they're often or traditionally considered to be independently functioning systems. In support of this idea, there's a wide collection of lab-based studies that have shown that these two systems actually support distinct sets of behaviors. So semantic memory supports the retrieval of general facts about the world and yourself, as well as vocabulary, whereas the episodic memory system supports the retrieval of distinct contextually bound events from your own past. However, many have argued against this classic distinction and have suggested that these two forms of memory likely interact, particularly during complex retrieval tasks like autobiographical memory recall. So to illustrate, I'll use a sort of silly example from my own life. So last year's Psychonomics meeting, I went to a bar in New Orleans, and thinking back to this event, I can use my episodic memory system to recall the details of the bar, to what I was wearing, the sound of the jazz music I was listening to, bumping into the actress Kirsten Dunst. It's a true story, my only celebrity sighting. And I can use my semantic memory system to draw upon the knowledge of the fact that New Orleans is in Louisiana and that Kirsten Dunst is an actress in the TV program Fargo. Oops. Let's see if I can go back. Yeah, so together, this sort of suggests that the richness of this recollective experience, and me thinking back to the bar, really critically depends on an interdependence between episodic and semantic memory. And so to further understand the nature of this potential or proposed interaction, we can ask a couple of questions. So first we can ask if semantic knowledge affects the ability to retrieve episodic information. And next we can ask the inverse question. So during classically semantic tasks, are episodic memory processes actually recruited? So I'll talk a little bit more about the second question, but I'm just going to touch briefly on the first in the context of autobiographical memory retrieval. So the idea that semantic memory can influence episodic recall isn't new. It's rooted in theories of autobiographical memory organization, which suggest that the contextual details and specific events are embedded within the broader semantic aspects of an experience. And these models propose that when recalling the past, semantic information is often accessed first, and this can act as a scaffold which can guide our search for the more contextually specific episodes and details. And one consequence of this organizational structure is that when the more general aspects of an event are retrieved or activated, the more specific elements can be primed via spreading activation throughout the organizational structure. So these models can provide a framework that can help us to understand how episodic and semantic memory actually interact. But contemporary research has suggested that not all semantics are created equal. So there's different forms of semantic information, and I'll touch upon these three. So first we have general semantics, which is what we're most familiar with. So this represents general knowledge of the world that's been completely abstracted from its learning context. So for example, knowing what coffee is. Next we have autobiographical facts, which are general facts and knowledge about yourself, so they're personal. So the fact that I drink coffee, I love coffee, I need to start my day, like I like my coffee black would be two examples, preferences. And finally, we have repeated events, which are contextualized events that are repeated across time, so they've lost their temporal specificity. So for example, I drink coffee every morning and I make it in my kitchen. But an open question remains as to how these different forms of semantic knowledge interact with or influence the retrieval of episodic memory. So our lab, in collaboration with Renoult, set out to address this question with a behavioral priming study. So we use three types of semantic primes, which map onto the three different forms of semantic knowledge, which I presented a moment ago. Each participant viewed the prime and answered true or false as quickly as possible with a button press in terms of how it applies to them. So for example, if I saw the autobiographical fact, I take milk in my coffee every day, I would answer false because I drink my coffee black. After answering each of the primes, they saw a memory cue which overlapped in content with the previously viewed prime, and they were asked to think of a specific past personal event from their own life as quickly as possible and press a button when that event came to mind. They then described that memory briefly in a couple of sentences. Our main outcome variable in the study was the reaction time to access a specific event. And as you can see, we tested younger and older adults, but I'm going to focus today just on cognitive collapse across age groups and focus primarily on the semantic priming effect on episodic retrieval. So here you'll see these data plotted. We analyzed the reaction time data using linear mixed effects modeling, where the dependent variable was the reaction time to access a specific episodic event. I'm ignoring this side of the room, I'm sorry. We found a main effect of age group, which unsurprisingly for younger adults, they were faster to access an episodic memory overall compared to the older adult counterparts. But most interestingly, we found a main effect of prime condition. I'll see if I can get the pointer working. Here we go. So compared to the control condition, which was a symbol task, across age group, individuals were faster to access a episodic memory when primed with both repeated events or autobiographical facts. And there was a trend where individuals were faster, regardless of age, to access specific autobiographical events when primed with repeated events. So what does this tell us? Well, overall, this suggests that some forms of semantic knowledge interact more directly with episodic retrieval than others. So if we think back to how this information theoretically is organized, it suggests that because individuals were faster to access repeated events, episodic events when primed with repeated event information, that this particular type of semantics might be more closely or directly linked to episodic information as compared to autobiographical facts and general knowledge. So theoretically, this promotes or supports the idea of a gradient of autobiographical knowledge that runs from more general to specific episodic events, which will be discussed in more detail later in the session, I think. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about the role of episodic memory processes in classical semantic tasks. And there are a couple of ways that this can play out. First, semantic retrieval can potentially benefit from accessing episodic information, which can be used as a strategy to help search for the required semantic knowledge. And second, the processes associated with episodic memory may in fact be leveraged to help perform semantic tasks. So with respect to the first point, category fluency is a classical semantic task. It's used in the lab and in the clinic to measure semantic memory retrieval. In this task, for those who are unfamiliar, individuals are presented with a category and they're asked to retrieve as many items as possible belonging to that category in a fixed period of time, which is generally 60 seconds. Some research has suggested that some forms of category fluency can actually benefit from accessing autobiographical or contextual information to help guide that search. So for instance, if I gave you the category of animals, you might think of a farm or a zoo and mentally navigate this context in order to help you generate examples of animals during the task. And in support of this idea, some neuropsychological work has shown that damage to the hippocampus, which supports episodic memory retrieval, impairs performance on certain types of category fluency tasks. So in our lab, some work done by my supervisor, Dr. Sheldon, she wanted to take this one step further and look in healthy individuals to see if episodic retrieval strategies are represented at the level of the hippocampus. So to address this question, young adults were scanned while they completed a category fluency task. Here I'm just going to focus on two categories. I'm happy to talk about the other ones at a later time. So autobiographical categories, this was touched on in the introduction. The items are related by a shared autobiographical concept, so movies that you've seen or names of friends. And this can be contrasted to spatial categories where the items are connected by a shared context, so things you might find in your kitchen or your living room. And these categories were presented randomly to participants, and for each category they had 36 seconds to generate as many items as possible that belonged to that category, and they pressed a button each time an item came to mind. So note that the goal inherently of this task is to retrieve semantic information, but you can see how these types of categories might benefit from a more episodic strategy. So briefly, we looked at the hippocampus. Well, Dr. Sheldon looked at the hippocampus, and what we find is for both types of categories, the hippocampus was robustly recruited, which suggests that indeed episodic processes are important for completing these types of semantic category fluency tasks. What's really interesting is that for the different forms of category fluency, there was a dissociation within the hippocampus, such that for the more autobiographical categories, you see recruitment of the anterior region of the hippocampus, whereas for spatial categories, you see recruitment of the posterior hippocampus. So not only does this fall in line with theories of specialization within this structure, but it also suggests that episodic strategies can be flexibly recruited as a function of the demands of the retrieval task that you're engaged in. So now I'm going to touch on episodic processes and how they can be leveraged during some types of semantic tasks. So what are episodic processes actually doing? So one theory that our lab bases our work on is that when recalling the past, the episodic memory system supports recollection by allowing you to associate together details from past experiences into a coherent mental representation. And there's new theories that suggest that these same associative processes are implemented during non-memory tasks that can benefit from integrating multiple forms of knowledge together, much like we do when we remember. So one example of this task would be problem solving. So in the lab, problem solving is often studied as an executive function task, and sometimes with real world problems, they can be solved using established scripts or schemas that are retrieved using our semantic memory system. There's a new body of literature, newish, that looks at real world problem solving. And so we think about the kinds of scenarios that we find ourselves in the real world. They're often open-ended, such that they can be solved using multiple different solution paths, and the outcome goals are often idiosyncratic, ambiguous, and unclear. So situations like this can really benefit from the constructive power of episodic memory to help individuals build and simulate different solution options and outcomes to help the problem solver navigate these types of ambiguous scenarios. So one great example of an open-ended problem would be social problems. So trying to figure out why a friend is mad at you and what you should do. So I'm going to present some data from a series of studies where we looked at the role of episodic memory in this sort of classical semantic task. So to do so, we tested a number of populations with damage or deterioration to the hippocampus. And we gave all of our participants a social problem-solving task. So this is a standardized measure called the means end problem-solving task. Briefly, participants are presented with 10 different vignettes where they're given the problem scenario as well as an outcome. So in the example presented here, you have Mr. C, who's just moved to a new neighborhood. He doesn't know anybody, he's lonely, and the story ends with him making friends and feeling at home in the neighborhood. So participants, their job is to describe a solution path that will allow Mr. C to get from the problem state to the outcome that's presented. So we scored these problems descriptions in a couple of different ways. So first we evaluated effectiveness using a protocol that was borrowed from the means end problem solving task. So here the solution descriptions are segmented into steps or actions, which are classified as effective or ineffective. An effective step is essentially one that moves the protagonist in the story closer to the prescribed outcome goal, whereas an ineffective step would be one that is directed towards a different goal or involves magical thinking, for example. We also scored these solutions using an adapted protocol from the autobiographical interview, which has been established to quantify episodic memory recruitment during these types of tasks. So I won't describe it in too much detail, but briefly the solution descriptions are segmented into details which are assigned a category of either internal or external detail. An internal detail is one that relates directly to the solution being described and is considered to be a measure of episodic memory recruitment, whereas external details are non-episodic, so they usually capture metacognitive content, semantic information, as well as off-topic information. So first we looked at performance on this task in medial temporal lobe epilepsy patients. So briefly, this population is associated with damage or surgical excision to the hippocampus, which is associated with episodic memory impairments. And what we found was, one, when we looked at problem-solving effectiveness, these temporal lobe epilepsy patients generated significantly fewer effective steps and more ineffective steps compared to age-matched controls. And when we looked at episodic memory recruitment, what we found was in these solution descriptions, individuals are also generating, temporal lobe epilepsy patients are generating specifically fewer episodic details and about the same number of non-episodic details. So together this kind of suggests that not only does this patient population present with autobiographical memory decline, but when they solve these open-ended social problems, they're providing solution descriptions that are less episodically rich and less effective. And so finally, we asked where in the brain where in the retrieval process this overlap might occur. So problem solving is multiphasic. It's associated with, often first you have to retrieve different solutions, evaluate them, choose one, and implement it to solve the problem. So we wanted to kind of look at where in this process episodic memory recruitment is most important. And so to do so, we tested some healthy young adults. We put them in the scanner. We had them retrieve specific episodic events as well as solutions to open-ended social problems. And we had them describe them as well in detail or mentally simulate them in detail in the scanner. And our most important finding, our most important finding in the context of this talk was of robust activation of the hippocampus when individuals were accessing solutions and accessing memories to problems. So what this suggests is that initially when individuals are constructing that solution or constructing that memory, so when the constructive demands are highest during the task, the hippocampus is commonly engaged for both memory and problem solving. So ultimately this suggests that for open-ended problem solving during the access phase when individuals are first generating solutions to problems, this is when the episodic component or demand is the highest. So in conclusion, I presented some evidence today that semantic processes can help to facilitate access to episodic information. This finding helps to refine our understanding of organizational structure of autobiographical memory by suggesting that certain types of semantic knowledge are more closely linked to episodic information than others. And really the strength of the association depends on how much that semantic information has been abstracted from its original context. And so again, this sort of supports this idea of a gradient within the autobiographical memory knowledge structure. Two, I've talked about how episodic retrieval processes can be used as a strategy to help guide retrieval of semantic information, and this is actually represented in the brain. And finally, we use episodic memory processes during many non-episodic tasks, such as social problem solving. So altogether, this means that conceptualizing the memory system as an isolated set of systems really restricts our understanding of how we approach complex tasks in the real world. So I'm going to thank all of our contributors as well as the amazing undergraduate students who helped collect and analyze much of this data and our funding sources. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take 2 questions.
Yeah.
Oh, me. Lovely talk.
Thank you.
Nice job standing in.
Thank you.
In your final task there, the problem-solving task, you described that as a constructive process. And I was wondering if you mean that in the sense that activity in the hippocampus was correlating with some sort of construction, or that individuals were using memories, past individual memories, to simulate what they might do in this new event.
It's a really good question, and we can't 100% tease it apart with these data. In the task that I presented after the fact, so the neuroimaging study, we had individuals complete a post-scan interview where they talked about the kinds of memories and solutions to problems they were retrieving, and we had them complete a couple of rating scales. So in short, what this data showed us was that the majority of the time participants were actually reported they were projecting themselves into the future, that they weren't sort of recasting the past to solve the problem. And for many of these problems, participants reported they'd never actually experienced the particular scenario we were presenting to them before. So it's not 100%, but it does suggest that that's not the only thing that's going on, is that people are sort of recasting the past.
So I had a question about this idea that there's a gradient of semantic knowledge contributing to episodic memory. And it looked like from the data, rather than a gradient, it did look like there's a qualitative difference between general semantic knowledge and personal semantics. Mm-hmm. And would you say that rather than a gradient going from the general knowledge to repeated personal semantics, that there is a qualitative difference between those kinds of semantic knowledge, and really the personal semantics is what is priming the episodic memories?
Yeah, it's a good question. I may not be the best person to answer this question, but I'll take a stab at it, and maybe one of the subsequent speakers can help to elaborate on this a little bit further. My understanding is that it could be that there's a gradient that exists, and there's some neuroimaging data that suggests that there's a graded response in some of the brain regions that support these sort of the gradient or the different types of personal semantic information. It also could be that there's like a weighted, different component processes are supporting these different types of semantic retrieval. And so they are in fact distinct from one another, but that sort of how much they're drawing on different underlying cognitive processes shifts from one to the other. I don't know if that answers your question.
The general semantic knowledge, did that prime more than control, or?
So it primed more than control, but that difference was not statistically significant in our sample.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So our next speaker is Zach Ria from the University of Washington at St. Louis.
Okay, hi. I'm Zach. I'm currently a postdoc at UC Davis working with Charan Ranganath, and I'm going to be starting as an assistant professor at WashU in St. Louis next year. I want to thank Louis and Signy, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, for having me here to talk to you all about some of my work on how we represent and remember complex events. So Louis really nicely introduced the concepts here, so I won't belabor the point, but ever since Tulving kind of delineated episodic and semantic memory, we've been kind of chewing on these issues ever since. Traditionally, episodic memory has been thought to be these kind of personally experienced events situated in a spatiotemporal context. So I was going to give this like Golden Gate Bridge example, but I think Sarah's example is just going to completely blow anything else out of the water. So bumping into Kirsten Dunst versus knowing, that Bourbon Street is in New Orleans. And on the topic of knowing, semantic information has been described as this kind of general knowledge that's devoid of that spatiotemporal context. There is, as Lou was describing, these things are pretty conceptually distinct in a lot of ways, but the evidence for neural distinctiveness is decidedly mixed, and in fact there's quite a bit of evidence that there's overlap, in fact quite a lot of overlap between these two processes in the brain. So I want to step back for a second and just think about how we usually study episodic memory, or even just memory broadly, in the laboratory. So since Ebbinghaus's pretty famous word learning experiments, we've been largely studying memory via tasks where you learn things like lists of words, series of objects or items, just static images, that kind of a thing. And we've learned a whole lot from tasks like this, where, for example, you might study 20 words and then later, after some delay, you recall as many as you can. So we've learned a lot about how memory works and how memory works in the brain from these things. But there's kind of a problem, and one that's been kind of tickling the back of my head for a while now, is that this really may not do that amazing a job of touching on how we encounter and remember information from our real lives, where things are kind of nasty and intermixed and kind of run together, and we have to kind of figure out how to chunk these things and make sense of them. So one of the big things that I kind of want to impress on everybody that I think is fairly obvious when you think about it is that real events have structure. They don't really feature these isolated entities, but rather things that are interrelated and fit into structures and frameworks. And once we learn how certain events play out, we can use this information to understand current situations and even make predictions. It's like a low-hanging example would be there's kind of a circumscribed set of things that happen when you're making breakfast in the morning. Alternatively, we can use new information to kind of update what we think is going on in these events if, your cereal catches on fire, for example. But I think the really important thing to kind of step back and realize is that these kind of understanding these events really kind of depends on, understanding the singular event that you've got with these items in a particular context. And structured knowledge about the past, which you might be able to construe as an episodic versus semantic kind of a distinction, and those things seem to be working together. But what are the rules of this game? How is this all organized? And I'll get to how I think it's organized in the brain. So you have events, which are these experiences that fit within a spatial, temporal, and situation context. So me up here giving this talk, for example, you might think of that as being an event. Over a lifetime, we build up a library of these kinds of events, and you might have an event schema, for example, of what it's like for someone to be up here giving a talk. And this is organized knowledge about particular types of situations and places and contexts that you might encounter. We also build up a vast library of knowledge about the kinds of entities like people, objects, etc. that occupy those situations and those contexts. So how do these pieces fit together in the brain? What evidence do we have for this? So some of you may be familiar with this, and I won't have time to go into a ton of the evidence here. But essentially, Charan and those of us in the lab who have been working on this have thought about this in terms of two cortico-hippocampal brain networks. So let's say, for example, you're walking in downtown Davis, you meet your friend, you go to a coffee shop, and you sit down and have a conversation. There's a lot of evidence from neuroimaging, patients with lesions, et cetera, that this posterior medial system, comprised of areas like parahippocampal cortex, retrosplenial cortex, and posterior parietal areas, seems to represent contextual elements and situations. And at a higher level, how these contexts seem to have circumscribed sets of things that happen. And this contrasts with an anterior temporal network that evidence points to representing things like entities, so objects and concepts about those objects out in the world. And importantly, the hippocampus is kind of the nexus of these two networks, where you get this kind of bound representation of a specific thing in a specific place at a specific time. So what I'm going to show you next is data from a study that I've been working on that tries to get at how the brain parses complex events as we encode and retrieve them. So what does a real-world event look like? I'm going to show you a video clip in a moment just briefly that depicts an event you probably see every week, some of you every day. Note that there's going to be a lot going on there, but immediately you're able to sort of pick apart the relevant bits of information. So this is actually one of my experimental stimuli that I'll go into. So I won't play the whole thing. It's a 40-second video clip. But it's important to clarify here why we would use a naturalistic event. And I kind of got at this before, that in the real world you have this continuous flow of information, and it's kind of on you / on your brain to pick apart what the relevant pieces are. And you're able to do this really, really well all the time. So here's the experiment that we designed. We have 20 participants, and for encoding of these particular events, we have 3 runs in the MRI scanner with 8 video clips. Each of them kind of takes a format like the brief bit of the one that I just showed you. Then during recall, there's a single run where we cue people with the name of the event, like the name that you just saw. And then for 40 seconds, they are cued to speak into an MRI-compatible microphone and remember as much as they can in order if possible. If you're wondering whether we can hear, it's a unfortunately very expensive microphone, but it filters out scanner noise pretty well, so yes, we actually can. Then post-MRI, we have a true-false recognition task. So you saw a clip from this particular video here with this character that I'm calling Lisa in this particular cafe. We also have another character that I'm going to call Tommy. And here's an extra layer for you. We had not one cafe, but 2 cafes. So we have this broad concept of cafe that we can test here. And we also have grocery stores. So what we've done is we've factorially combined which character you're seeing, which context they're in, and which type of context that they're in. So we're able to look at, by controlling all of these variables, what kind of stable representations persist as we change one thing or another. So here's what we would predict based on that anterior temporal, posterior medial framework that I was describing. So if the posterior medial network represents situations and context, we would expect to see patterns of brain activity that reflect contextual information but don't really seem to care much about what person is there. And the flip side is what we would expect for the anterior temporal network, so stable patterns assigned to particular people that persist across changing contexts. And then finally, the hippocampus, based on a lot of what we know in the field, is that it should kind of give you that item in context, or rather in this case, person in context, super specific kind of a representation. So the first analyses that I'm going to show you focused on what happens when people process the events in these movies in real time. So we're comparing runs of encoding to other runs of encoding. So the way this looked from a participant's perspective, I'll use this one for now. For 5 seconds, you were cued with the title of the event. And then for 40 seconds after that, you watch the event play out, and participants were instructed only to pay attention and immerse and try to pretend it was something they were seeing in the real world. Then there was a 10-second break while we waited for all the nasty, bold activity stuff to return to baseline, and then we moved on to the next event. And these were pseudo-randomized across runs and across participants. After that, we did a pattern similarity analysis, and I don't have time to really get into the nitty-gritty on this, but I'm happy to answer any methods questions after if anyone's interested. But basically, we averaged activity across a whole video clip. You did not hear that wrong. We got an average pattern of brain activity in the regions we were interested in that persisted across the whole event. And what we did was we took that pattern of brain activity in run 1, compared it to run 2 and run 3. So we could compare patterns for this event to itself across runs. We could compare this event to another event across runs. So that way we can really get all the comparisons that we're interested in. So, real quick sanity check. We first wanted to assure ourselves that people actually remembered what was in the video clips. So if they didn't remember the events, you know, what are we actually looking at when we look at brain activity? So that was super important. The first thing we did was that true-false recognition test post-scan. And essentially this was just statements about the events that they endorsed as either true or false. So the thing I want to just kind of impress on you here is that discrimination between true and false information was actually quite good, and there wasn't any kind of bias across the context or the people depicted in the videos. Sorry about that. Okay. And then we also scored the recall in the scanner, and we did this using a variant of Brian Levine's autobiographical interview, but here it was kind of a simplified version where we just scored verifiable details versus false details, or information that they provided which was not true. And on average, people actually remembered a pretty surprising amount of discrete details, so just shy of 15 on average. But again, we didn't really see any kind of bias for particular contexts or particular people. So let's move into the neuroimaging results. So we anticipated seeing something like a context effect or contextual patterns in the posterior medial network, and that would look something like anything happening in this cafe would look similar to anything happening in the same cafe regardless of who's there. And we essentially do see that. So here I'm showing you angular gyrus. This is normalized pattern similarity on the y-axis. The x-axis we have same, similar, or different context. And as a reminder, similar would be like Cafe 1 versus Cafe 2. And then in blue we have same character, and then in orange we have different character. So what you see here in angular gyrus is that pattern similarity is highest when you're comparing the same context to itself, regardless of which character they're seeing. And this drops even if the context is similar. And we see very similar things in posterior medial cortex, which is like precuneus, retrosplenial cortex, and parahippocampal cortex. So one thing you might notice is that for posterior medial cortex, we actually get this kind of middling effect where the similar context is somewhere in between. So this suggests that there's at least some generalization going on. But wait till you see medial prefrontal cortex. So here what we see actually is generalization across even similar situations. So this is kind of worth, attending to how striking it is that the perceptual information that they're getting across this particular instance and that particular instance, there's almost nothing in common there except that they are in cafes. So this is kind of a hyper-general contextual signal that we're seeing as opposed to the more specific contextual signal we were seeing in other posterior medial areas. Okay, and rounding things out to the anterior temporal network, what we expected to see is something that looked like a character representation or stable patterns of brain activity associated with characters, and we do in fact see that. So in the perirhinal cortex and the temporal poles, we see higher pattern similarity when people are viewing the same character as opposed to a different character, and context doesn't really seem to play that big a role here. So finally, moving on to the hippocampus, we actually do find something that looks like a specific event representation. So we find an uptick in pattern similarity of brain activity for the same person, same context comparison, but as soon as you change anything, we see pattern similarity go down. So this looks a lot like an episodic event timestamp. Next, we wanted to ask if these representations we see during coding are reinstated when people are remembering the events. So this actually worked very similarly, except during that recall run, when being queued with the name of the event, instead of the event coming up after 5 seconds, nothing really happened on the screen, and they just started speaking into the microphone and remembering that event as best they could. So again, we modeled brain activity during that recall interval, and what we did in this case is compared each of the encoding runs to the recall run. So we got to look for whether those brain patterns during encoding were reinstated when people were remembering. So were people actually reinstating these patterns of activity? Not to belabor the point, yes, they actually were. So if we look in posterior medial areas, we see kind of context reinstatement. We see reinstatement of character-specific patterns in perirhinal cortex. Medial prefrontal cortex, we see this hypergeneral schema-like pattern come up. And then the hippocampus, we see event-specific patterns start to reemerge. So I'm going to walk you through one quirky last analysis that we're trying. This looks super crazy, but I promise you it's not that bad. So what we did here, previously I was describing taking a pattern of activity that persisted across the whole event, right? But you're throwing away a lot of information there. So what happens if you go time point by time point and look at how these patterns emerge as time progresses? So on the y-axis, what you have is time starting at the top and then going down. And then this is for the very first run. So remember, y-axis is the first time you're seeing that event, and this comparison is the same event to itself across runs. On the x-axis, what you're seeing is time going from left to right, but this is the average of the second and third runs. So the way to think about this is first time you're seeing it, later times that you're seeing it. So what you see, if you look at the hippocampus, is that for a given time point, when you're comparing it across runs, it's pretty similar to itself. So that's that hot diagonal that you're seeing there. What's even more interesting, though, is you see these kind of bursts of more widespread event similarity at the beginning and then at the very end. And what's even cooler is this end event pattern actually seems to sweep back earlier in time in subsequent viewings. This is actually pretty consistent with the idea that the hippocampus might not be continuously giving you event information, but it might be giving you kind of a distilled stamp of this was the point of what I just saw, once it's had time to kind of digest and assess the whole event. This jumps out at you a little bit more if I mask by which comparisons across time points are significant. And one last thing I'll leave you with is that if you look at posterior medial cortex, this context signal that we were seeing, it looks very different. So the entire event pattern, all of the time points seem to kind of correlate with one another in this case. Okay, so to summarize, we think that encoding and remembering a realistic event involves concurrent representation of different kinds of information, supported by different parts of the brain. So you get something like a schema representation, or the most general type of contextual representation in medial prefrontal cortex. And this feeds into contextual representations throughout the rest of the posterior medial network, where you get these more specific contextual representations. And then finally, you get this bound specific event representation in the hippocampus, which is also receiving information broadly about entities and things out in the world from the anterior temporal network. The information exists across multiple levels of abstraction, though. That is, there are both episodic and semantic components probably at play here. So you get the most specific episodic-like signal in the hippocampus, where you get that bound representation. And then at various levels of the anterior temporal and posterior medial networks, you get bits of information that are flexible and can extend across multiple experiences that actually seems quite a lot like a semantic signal to me. So the take-home point here is that the hippocampus is probably using structured semantic information from these content-sensitive cortical regions and using that as a scaffold to build a representation of specific experiences. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, thank Charan and my lab, and as a shameless plug, if anyone's looking for graduate student or postdoc positions next year, I am happy to chat. Thanks so much.
Nice talk. I presume you know that there's some debate right now about how long the hippocampus keeps those event representations. So what can you say about that issue? How long could you wait and still see evidence of that representation in the hippocampus?
Yeah, so honestly, I'm the type that I'd like to really go after that in a paradigm like this and see how long it persists, but there certainly is evidence that hippocampal involvement might fade over time or not. In particular, I would think that hippocampus would probably try to be involved, even if it's not utterly necessary, in any kind of combined episodic-like representation. So getting at the question of involvement versus necessity is an entirely different can of worms. But my personal thought is that if you have a hippocampus, it will try to do that kind of thing.
I think we have to move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Matthew Greeley from the University of Arizona.
Thank you, Louis, for inviting me to be a part of this symposium. The focus of my talk today is on a type of long-term declarative memory known as personal semantic memory, or personal semantics for short. This is, as you've learned already from other speakers, the type of knowledge that we have about ourselves, about our life history. And today I'd like to present some data from individuals who have medial temporal lobe amnesia that I think nicely highlights why personal semantics is an interesting example of where we see the interaction between episodic memory and semantic memory. I like to begin with this excerpt, which I believe comes from one of the first descriptions of personal semantics in an individual with medial temporal lobe amnesia. And it comes from Cermak and O'Connor's description of the patient SS. In their evaluation of his retrograde memory, they did a fairly extensive review of SS's autobiographical memory. And on the basis of that evaluation, they concluded that SS had no episodic memory for any events in his life, past or present. Recollections instead seemed to be drawn entirely from what they called a personal pool of generalized knowledge about himself, that is, his own semantic memory. And I like this quote for two reasons. One, it nicely captures an idea that persists in current cognitive theories of autobiographical memory, which is that our life history consists of more than episodes. There's also a large repository or pool of knowledge that we store about our life experiences. The other is that by showing such a stark contrast in an individual with amnesia, it sort of gave the impression that persisted for a while that there may be a clear distinction between episodic memory and personal semantics. And perhaps personal semantics instead reflects some sort of subtype of other forms of semantic memory or concepts. And there has been a great deal of evidence to support a connection between semantic memory or general semantics and personal semantics. But over the years, there's also been an accumulation of evidence to suggest that there may not be such a clear distinction between episodic memory and personal semantics too. Some of this comes from actually a few of the earliest studies in functional neuroimaging of autobiographical memory, and recent meta-analyses have confirmed this notion and shown that there are robust associations between the retrieval of personal semantics. From this review, it's Martinelli and colleagues, and personal semantics are shown in green, and regions of the medial temporal lobe and posterior cortical regions that have been more strongly implicated in episodic memory. Those outcomes have been largely corroborated by neuropsychological data as well, where even in individuals who have isolated lesions to the medial temporal lobe, it's more often than not that you see compromised personal semantic retrieval if you conduct a review of their autobiographical memory. And these sort of merging lines of research and findings have led many to view personal semantics, much like Louis and his colleagues nicely reviewed and elaborated in a 2012 TICS article, with personal semantics sort of situated at the crossroads, or as Louis put it earlier, at the frontiers of episodic memory and semantic memory, general semantics. In my lab, we've been particularly interested in trying to get a better sense of what cognitive features might drive this sort of overlap. How can we try to understand why there seems to be a blurring of the boundaries? And the hypothesis that we've been working at is that personal semantics, and you've heard this earlier as well, may not in fact be a unitary type of memory. Instead, there may be two distinct subtypes. One where personal semantics seem to have maintained some connection to the spatial temporal event context from which they've been derived. An example of such a personal semantic could be I often hike in the Tucson desert. It's semantic in nature and personal, but it still has a connection to a particular event sequence and place. We have other personal semantics that are far more abstracted from the experiences that they come from. An example can be I live an active lifestyle. These seem to be more free of event context and may in fact be more closely aligned with general semantics, with spatial temporal reference bound personal semantics being more closely aligned with episodic memory. So from this viewpoint, we've sort of appraised personal semantics as being a distinction between those that are experienced near and therefore more like episodic memory or episodic-like, and those that are experienced far or more abstract and similar to general semantics. In this framework, experience near personal semantics should, like episodic memory, depend on the medial temporal lobe, whereas experience far personal semantics, being like general semantics, should be more dependent on the cortex for retrieval. From this perspective, we've argued that much of the overlap that we see in personal semantics for episodic memory and general semantics, whether it's in the neuroimaging or neuropsychological literature, may reflect imprecision in the type of stimuli or prompts that we use, ultimately resulting in a heterogeneous and somewhat moving or dynamic set of personal semantics that can lead to these sorts of overlaps. And if we are able to isolate experience near and experience far information more directly, we could see a clearer separation between episodic memory and semantic memory networks. So one way to go about addressing this question is to study personal semantics in individuals who have medial temporal lobe amnesia. A nice feature of this population is that by definition, they will have profound episodic memory deficits, and it gives us an opportunity to ask whether their experience near personal semantics are also and perhaps equally compromised. In contrast, general semantics are commonly preserved in individuals with medial temporal lobe amnesia, and so perhaps we should expect to see experience far personal semantics being spared as well. In other words, that pool of personal knowledge that Cermak and O'Connor recognized may in fact be a pool of very experienced far information. So when my colleague Mika Verfai and I introduced this idea of experience near versus far, we subsequently did present some evidence to support this viewpoint based on a pool of facts that we had collected from individuals with amnesia over the years. But today I'd like to present some unpublished data led by my graduate student Aubrey Wenck that I think nicely captures the degree to which we can see a shift in the personal pool of knowledge in individuals with medial temporal lobe amnesia. And this is from 4 patients and 16 controls matched on age, education, and gender. I won't go into much detail about the patients now, other than to note that 2 had bilateral medial temporal lesions and 2 had unilateral. They all meet sort of basic expectations for an amnestic syndrome from a neuropsychological perspective. Here I'm just showing differences between verbal intelligence and delayed memory. But general semantics have also been thoroughly tested in these individuals, and they are largely within normal limits on standard neuropsychological tests of language and general semantics. One of our goals here was to take a deeper dive into this pool of personal semantics that these individuals with medial temporal amnesia have accessible to them. And so we were inspired by Conway's sort of hierarchical viewpoint of autobiographical memory and asked what if we tried to interrogate this pool of knowledge from multiple entry points. So to the right, this is an adapted schematic of the Conway hierarchy. But the basic idea is that you have access to a pool of episodic and semantic information that, building on the notion that memory is reconstructed, can be drawn on to create different narratives of our life. Some of these narratives can be very event-based. Others can be broader in scope and capture periods of time in our life or aspects of our life story. And other narratives can be even more abstract and capture sort of core features of our identity or our self-concept. So in this study, we asked our amnesic participants and controls to enter their autobiographical memory through these different entry points. So we asked them to describe unique life events, to tell us portions of their life story, and to describe their identity based on prompts that they gave us. The data that I'll present today is all retrograde in nature. We wanted to be careful about separating deficits in new learning from storage and retrieval of previously formed memories. And in order to get a better sense of what sort of knowledge and episodic details people were drawing on, we too adapted Brian Levine's autobiographical interview scoring approach. I've, to the right, shown an example of a narrative from a healthy control who's describing a unique event. And the way that we adapted this is we were particularly interested in identifying instances where the semantics or context that people provided while describing these events were experience near or experience far in quality. And we maintained the episodic or internal detail category that comes with this Levine scoring approach. And this allows you to get a sense of the variability in which you use different types of content to construct your narratives. So again, to summarize before I show the data, our two basic questions here were, do individuals with medial temporal lobe amnesia primarily rely on experience far personal semantics to narrate their autobiographical history? And is experience near personal semantic retrieval seemingly as compromised as episodic detail, which we might expect if they rely on overlapping neural mechanisms? So I'll start with the type of data that most people in this room are probably most used to looking at, and that is content or detail generation while describing unique life events. We have in the box plot the control data, so you can see that there's a range, but these unique events are usually elaborated with a lot of episodic detail. In contrast, and not surprisingly, the medial temporal lobe amnesic participants generate very little or no episodic details when trying to describe unique life events. What's newer and more interesting here is a performance for personal semantics. So first I'm just showing the control data, and we think it's interesting that when describing unique life events, controls tend to draw on more episodic-like or experience near personal semantics than experience far ones to elaborate on these events. When we turn to the data from the medial temporal lobe participants, we see that like episodic detail, experience near personal semantics are severely compromised and near the floor, whereas they're well within normal limits or elevated in the generation of experience far personal semantics. So they can try to narrate unique life events, but they're doing it in a very abstract way. Turning to sort of the next step in the hierarchy, we're asking them to describe life stories from their past. The controls draw on about the same amount of episodic detail as they do when they describe unique life events to do this, and not surprisingly, the medial temporal lobe amnesic participants do as well, in the sense that they don't draw on virtually any. Turning to personal semantics, we see this carryover from unique life events to life stories, where there's, in the controls, a reliance on experience near personal semantics more than experience far. And also, similar to what we saw before with unique life events, personal experience near personal semantics are severely compromised. In this case, in the case of unique events, they were similar in their deficits. In this case, they're actually more severely impaired for generating experience near personal semantics than they were episodic details. And like before, they're well within normal limits for experience far. Turning to the last entry point, we asked them to describe aspects of their identity. This is something we've seen before, which is that healthy, normal controls don't actually rely on a lot of episodic details to describe their identity if it's an open-ended task. And not surprisingly, the medial temporal lobe amnesic participants don't either. The scale changes dramatically here on the y-axis so that we can see the data better, but one interesting feature is that this is the first instance where we see healthy controls are now actually relying on experience far personal semantics as much as experience near. So it's almost as if as we move up the hierarchy, the contents that we're using is becoming more and more abstract. And comparable to what we've seen before, the amnesic participants are not drawing on any experience near and are within normal limits or elevated on experience far. So they can describe their identity, they have a sense of who they are, but to ground that and elaborate on it, they're relying on a limited pool of information that's almost entirely experience far. Okay, so to summarize these, the points I've made so far, personal semantics we think may not be a unitary type of memory. These data seem to suggest that experience near personal semantics rely on the medial temporal lobe, and this is evident even attempting to sort of tackle this autobiographical knowledge base at multiple entry points. And there's some evidence here to suggest that experience near personal semantics may in fact be as compromised as episodic memory. Am I okay on time, Lonnie? Am I done? Okay. Well, I was going to tease some more data, but I don't want to take up any more and cut into Jess's time. So I can bring this up later. But this is a paper from 2018 where, as you know, I've mostly touched on here about the overlap between experience near and episodic memory. We've tried to tackle the other end as well and see how experience far personal semantics overlap with general semantics. But thank you.
Are there any questions?
In your healthy participants, have you looked at autobiographical, or I'll give you a chance to talk about your teased data semantics for near versus far, looking as a function of how far back in time those memories were?
So we're looking at that now, and we have preliminary data from a group of 40 older adults. And we do see a shift towards more experience far or abstract information for personal semantics the further back you go on their life timeline. We see, so this was a small group of controls for these amnesic participants. We've been doing these tasks in a larger group of controls across the adult age spectrum. And there, again, if you sort of borrow this or go with this hierarchy viewpoint, even within any time points, you do see a shift towards from specific or experience specific to abstract as you go from unique events to life story and self-concept. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Matt.
Yeah.
And our last speaker is Jessica Andrews-Hanna from the University of Arizona. And we'll have a general discussion at the end if you have a question addressed to all speakers.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm very excited to be here to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing in our lab on the dynamics of autobiographical thought and how I think it speaks to the interplay between episodic and semantic memory. Before I continue, I wanted to acknowledge that this work is really a collaborative effort between myself and my students, current and former, in my lab at the University of Arizona, as well as a number of colleagues, especially Wani Wu and Tor Wager. Okay, so we've heard today that recent years have brought a growing appreciation into the close relationships between episodic and semantic memory. And this is an idea, of course, as Louis mentioned earlier, that was brought forth by Endel Talving in his earlier ideas of a monohierarchical organization of memory systems, in which episodic memory sort of evolved out of semantic memory and acts as a subsystem within it. And much of the recent research on the interplay between these processes has really benefited from a growing relationship and crosstalk between the fields of memory research and language. And as was previewed, of course, earlier, these lines of work have shown that there's striking overlap between the regions of the brain that we engage during episodic recollection, often known as the core recollection network, as well as a number of regions that become active when we're engaged in semantic memory and conceptual processing. And of course, this supports the idea that concepts form the building blocks of our autobiographical memories. What I wanted to do today in this talk is to extend this link more broadly and suggest that concepts are, of course, not only important for our memories themselves, but also for our ability to consider the future, to think about the minds of other people, a process known as theory of mind, to engage in a number of different self-reflective processes, to our capacity to engage in creative thought and counterfactual thinking, and really a whole host of autobiographical and imaginative thought processes. And supporting this notion is really the observation that the processes that just talked about recruit a very similar set of brain regions as to the conceptual processing network that we talked about earlier. And of course, this network is known more broadly as the brain's default network. It's highly active and functionally connected over short and longer epochs of rest when people presumably default, so to speak, to thinking about their memories and plans and other sorts of thoughts more generally. So today I'd like to start from this broad notion that concepts form the building blocks of autobiographical and imaginative thought and ask whether, based on this intuition, there are similarities that exist in the types of themes that are emerging in our semantic networks as to those that are emerging in our episodic networks. Okay, so another line of work that we're very interested in my lab is the ways in which thoughts arise and unfold over time, that is, its dynamics. And so this characteristic is largely ignored by existing research. Of course, Zach mentioned a really awesome study that he's leading to look at this. But its importance was emphasized much earlier by William James when he likened the stream of thought to a bird's life consisting of a series of flight and perchings. And indeed, we believe that the dynamics of thought are important. They have important implications, not only for mental states within individuals, but also for traits that vary across individuals, and some of these traits can be important for mental health. So according to a taxonomy of thought that my colleagues Kalina Christoph, Zach Irving, Karen Fox, Nathan Sprang, and I put forth a couple of years ago, more stable and rigid thoughts are supposed to be sort of supported by, by constraints on cognition, either constraints that are deliberate in nature, where we're intentionally holding our thoughts toward a goal that we have over time, or possibly constraints that are automatic in nature, in which our thoughts are outside of our control, being directed toward highly habitual or highly salient topics or highly salient stimuli as well. Now, this sort of characteristic of thought, we think, is marking forms of rumination and other types of maladaptive repetitive thinking. Now, when constraints on cognition is relatively relaxed, another class of thought is likely to emerge, known as spontaneous thought, and this includes types of thinking like dreaming and mind wandering and creative thinking, where the mind is free to wander, and there's a lot of dynamics in our thoughts. So in our quest to understand the dynamic sort of semantic nature basis of autobiographical thought, my colleagues and I developed a task that we call the Free Association Semantic Task, or the FAST task for short, and this is sort of a dynamic twist on a standard free association task. So in this task, participants are shown a series of seed concepts that vary in their emotional qualities, in their valence. This is an example failure of a negative concept here. And participants are given 3 seconds to say aloud the first semantic associate that comes to mind in response to the seed word. So this person says lose. Then they're given 3 seconds to say aloud the first word that comes to mind, not in response to the seed concept, but in response to the previous word that they generated. So this person says lose, then disappointment, then parents. Already there might be an interesting link here. Then children, happiness, flying, sailing, water, fishing, eating. So you can see that from the example of this participant, starting with a very negative concept, by the fourth or so associate, this person has taken this negative concept and turned it positive, and that's kind of the conceptual state that they're attracted to. So I'm now going to show you an example of a very different type of person, a profile of their thoughts. So this person says failure, disappointment, wrongful, hateful, let down, tomorrow, work, layoff, failure. So I don't like looking at this because, you know, like fearing this will happen to me, right? But of course, as you can see, this person is really kind of getting stuck in this negative conceptual state, and in fact, at the very end, is even coming back full circle to the original seed concept that they started with. And here are examples of a number of different concepts that people were shown, seed concepts that vary in valence from strongly negative to strongly positive. Okay, so our first question was whether the nature of the concepts that people have within their semantic networks in the FAST task was related to the nature of the thoughts that people experience, more complex thoughts, including episodic autobiographical memories in day-to-day life. And so to explore this question, we modified an autobiographical thought sampling paradigm that we had developed a few years earlier, in which participants were asked to think about 6 of their most frequently occurring thoughts that they experience in day-to-day life within the past couple of weeks. And so here's an example of one particular person here. She says her first thought is worrying about having to pay taxes and not being able to come up with the money for it by the impending deadline. Her second thought is about worrying about having to send her son to the dentist for a major surgery that he has, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I wanted to highlight the third thought here, and an excerpt from that thought is, I will be experiencing a layoff here shortly, not knowing when is stressful but okay because I know a generalized time frame in which I'll be laid off. So you guys can probably already guess that this is the second participant that I showed in the context of the FAST task, the slide earlier, and already we're seeing some qualitative similarities between our semantic content, our concepts, and our more complex day-to-day thoughts. We wanted to quantify this relationship, however, and so the first way we decided to tackle this effort is to use text analysis to explore the degree to which different thematic content related to personal concerns and different life domains is similarly expressed during the FAST task, as well as one's autobiographical thoughts. And so we explored content across a number of different life domains: social life, work life, financial life, home life, leisure life, and health life. And we're pleased to see that across a number of these domains, we see some interesting similarities. Another aspect of semantic content that we looked at is emotional content. And first, we used, again, text analysis to explore similarities in the expression of positive emotion words as well as anxiety-related words, and consistent with our hypothesis, found some correspondence across individuals. We also then gave the words that people generated in the context of the FAST task to a bunch of Amazon MTurk raters, and asked them to rate the valence of each of the words in the context of the previous words that they generated, which I'm plotting here on the left, and compared the mean valence for each participant to the participant's own self-report rating of their valence of their autobiographical thoughts. And again, we see a correspondence here. Okay, so now shifting a bit to the dynamics, for the purposes of this talk, we are looking primarily at shifts in dynamic emotional properties, affective concepts, in the context of the FAST task. And one way we looked at the dynamics was to conduct a Markov chain analysis, in which we extracted the probability that individuals, if the previous word generated was positive, will stay and generate another subsequent positive word, or shift over to negative, and vice versa if the previous word generated was negative. And what we're finding across participants is that conceptual associations on average are very strongly attracted towards positive conceptual states, such that people are much more likely to continually generate positive words if the previous one was positive, than to shift away and generate a negative word, as well as to stay on negative conceptual states as well. We can also look at how these valence properties and how these dynamics relate to individual traits relevant to mental health. So we focused on rumination as a transdiagnostic construct. And so what we're seeing right here is that the mean valence of the fast words that are being presented here on the left relate to the degree of trait rumination, such that individuals who ruminate more in day-to-day life are generating words that are more negative in valence. This relationship is much stronger when restricting the analysis to the words generated following positive seed concepts. We can also look at the probability of effective state transitions and see how this in turn relates to rumination. And once again, consistent with our predictions, individuals who ruminate more are less likely to remain on positive concepts and more likely to shift away from a positive conceptual state to a negative state. And we can also quantify this by looking at simply the mean duration of positive versus negative concepts, the number of words in which people are generating that are positive versus negative subsequent words, and show a very similar finding. This effect is, again, much stronger following words, following positive seed concepts. Okay, so I framed the talk around the role of concepts and conceptual associations as really forming the building blocks of our autobiographical thoughts. But I wanted to also emphasize that there's likely, as was alluded to before, a lot of complex specificity within the default mode network and within our concepts. as well. And so there have been different proposals as to what the nature of this organizational specificity is and what its functions are. So as Zach outlined earlier, there's an anterior temporal system that supports encoding of individual entities, whereas a posterior medial subsystem supports understanding the relationship between those items, particularly in a context. Based on some of my own work, looking at the broader default network, we've proposed a hubs and subsystems organizational framework where we have a largely midline core being flanked by two separate subsystems, a medial temporal one, which actually overlaps quite significantly with the posterior medial memory subsystem, as well as a dorsal medial one, which includes dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, inferior frontal gyrus, TPJ, and aspects of the lateral temporal cortex. So it may be that these different parcellations, these different components within the default mode network support different aspects of contextual or conceptual content, or maybe even representational formats. So one idea that we wrote about recently was that the dorsal medial subsystem may support our ability to sort of abstract representations. This is what's happening often when we're considering other people's mental states and reflecting on our emotions, when we don't necessarily have all the time a visual representation of what we're thinking about. The medial temporal lobe subsystem, in turn, might support more concrete concepts, particularly those that are embedded in a spatial temporal context. The medial temporal subsystem for these concrete concepts are often represented additionally in a visual form. And then finally, the core seems to play this sort of general role, but what we're finding in some of our own work as well as the work of others is that activity in the core especially seems to support concepts that are deemed self-relevant. So this may really help us to understand what a concept means to us and how it integrates into my sort of self-schema. And there's a number of different pieces of support for this. Here's a couple that I'll highlight. This is when people are reading stories and the medial temporal subsystem is more engaged during vivid stories and abstract stories. The dorsal medial is more engaged when stories are abstract versus vivid, and the core does not distinguish between the two. Again, there's some more evidence for, at the level of individual concepts, abstract concepts seem to engage these dorsal, medial, and temporal polar regions, where the concrete ones engage more of the medial temporal ones. So in summary, I hope and of course, they all interact during everyday decision-making to support the functions of memory. So in summary, I hope I've convinced you today that via the default network, concepts form the building blocks of our autobiographical and imaginative thoughts, that conceptual associations are thematically and affectively related to the content of our everyday autobiographical thoughts, that ruminative individuals tend to get stuck in negative affective conceptual states, which really limits their minds from wandering freely. And that finally, of course, further studies are needed to understand the fine-grained nature of this organizational complexity. Thank you.
Questions? So I will ask all speakers to maybe come back to the stage if there are any questions for the group. Yes?
Hi. So great symposium. Really glad to see people talking about these distinctions. In overview, what I heard today was I thought, considerably more evidence that semantic memory is sort of prerequisite to episodic memory and helps to build episodic memory than the converse. But in some of the talks, there was a little bit of a, oh, it's all blurred, it sort of goes both ways. I'm very fond of the idea that semantics is more basic and episodic is onward or less basic or something like that, based on the fact that in development, kids build semantic memory, notably by learning words, long before they seem capable of forming episodic memories. So my question is, and I don't know if everybody wants to say this, is semantic basic to episodic in a way that episodic is not basic to semantic?
And I'm stuck holding the microphone. I suppose my viewpoint on it might be not well as formulated as yours, in the sense that I could imagine that there are episodic representations that are transformed over time when and dependent on the type of semantic information that's available. To me, it seems possible that there are some classes of episodic memories that we form that have a different type of meaning to them because they are grounded on a weaker sort of semantic knowledge base and or change in their quality and meaning once additional experiences occur and broader themes or schemas are extracted. So I don't think I'm answering your question, but maybe someone else will.
Yes, I think the perspective that was described is very much reminiscent of Handel Taving's perspective himself. I guess he would totally agree that episodic is an embellishment of semantic, and it's later evolved and later developing. So I guess I would agree with that personally.
Could I add a word or two here? It seems to me the question is not fully posed yet, right? I mean, the answer may depend upon, whether you're talking about encoding or retrieval or early in life versus late in life and so on. I mean, it seems clear that the concepts that we form as adults are dependent upon having episodes, that include the information that we're extracting to make a concept. It's also clear in development that you can form concepts without episodes. So I don't think there's a single answer. I think it's going to turn out to be complicated.
Right. What I want to point out specifically about that is that when you only study adults, it's very common to hear people claim what, in a way, Matt, you were saying, which is that semantic memory is built by abstracting over particular episodes. I do think adults can do that and do that. It's just not, it's not required.
Well, then it becomes interesting to ask whether the concepts that kids form lack certain content that the concepts that adults can form, given that they've got episodic memories that can, there may be differences in the kinds of concepts that one is capable of forming in the presence or absence of an episodic system.
Very cool.
Any other questions?
I'm not going to try to follow up on Lynn. So actually maybe start with the question that Louis led off with, that it seems as if the distinctions between episodic and semantic have become a little fuzzy, and that you asked maybe going forward we'll find new data that helps us to see now with better data reemerging clean distinctions between them, or maybe we'll see that the distinctions were never there to begin with. So maybe now that we've heard all these talks, and it doesn't have to then be whoever happens to have the microphone, maybe anyone can speculate on where you see it going, Because I do agree that we heard a lot of, it's a little bit of both from most of the talks.
I have the microphone, so I will start. So to me, one big question is if there is so much overlap, where is the phenomenological experience? Where is the subjective experience? So we talk about how understanding theory evolved over the years. And one thing that was very important is this autonoetic phenomenological experience of recollection. And so with the overlap, it's not that clear where it happens. And I think there are several candidates in the brain, but I think that's really something that's striking and that still need to be addressed.
So it's difficult to speak to where it's going to go in particular, but I can speak to one thing that I would like to see kind of addressed. It's been kind of chewing at me lately is when people discuss episodic versus semantic memory a lot of the time, there's this blurring between explanations and investigations at the level of a process versus representations. And that can lead you to different conclusions. If you're talking about is it an episodic process or is this an episodic representation? And the types of brain regions and the brain representations you might see would be pretty different depending on how you're answering that or how you're even asking that question. So I think making a delineation there and trying to dissociate between those two possibilities or those two approaches could actually get us a lot of insight. If we kind of hold the representational content, and you can see my own biases coming out here, if we kind of control the representational content and then vary the kind of retrieval strategies or processes that people could be employing, we might be able to tease them apart, or vice versa. If you try to hold the processes constant and then let the information content vary, I think that could be a really fruitful avenue to try to home us in a little bit more on like what it is that we're really looking at. But that's just me.
One other thing that I see as an outstanding question is, most of the analysis that we do as cognitive neuroscientists involve taking findings up from the participant level to the group level. And it may well be some recent data coming out of Randy Buckner's group is that at the level of participants, when you look at the individual organization of kind of brain regions and patterns of functional connectivity in an individual, if you have enough spatial resolution to be able to do that, different people display different patterns of connectivity and organization, and that when you bring this data up to the level of the group, it looks as though there are some really important commonalities that emerge. But I think we're just not there yet as a science. We're beginning to with our new methods. But I think that's kind of where the field needs to go, where, the part of my brain that encodes, one type of concept might be very different than Matt's brain that encodes that same kind of concept.
Yeah. And something that caught my attention was that in a way, the concepts of semantic and episodic reappeared within the categories. So you have experience near versus experience far in the person's semantics, for instance, or talking about autonoetic and noetic types of consciousness. For instance, the concept of self, again, can be split into more episodic self, phenomenological re-experience with conscious recollection versus the more semantic self. So in a way, yes, the boundary seems to have become more fuzzy, but as we now talk about within episodic and within semantic, we seem to reuse these concepts. And I also agree with this developmental and evolutionary perspective that needs to be also be kept in mind when talking about it. So the developmental perspective, I do think is important. So maybe it's like...
Yeah, so to that point, I didn't present the data at this level of detail, but so for an experience near classification, we do break it down by how event specific or spatial temporally specific the information seems to be. So we borrow this notion of repeated events, and we also include lifetime period information under that category. So that could be considered a fairly broad level of temporal specificity, and just saying something happened while you were in college. We still consider those experience near. At least in medial temporal lobe lesion cases, we don't see variability in, we don't see a gradient, for example, where it's easier for them to retrieve lifetime period relative to repeated event. So in that case, there seems to be sort of a not so much a qualitative shift over the course of the quality of that content, but sort of more of an underlining thread or the spatial temporal element that seems to be necessary. And if it's present, it seems to act more like episodic memory, and if it's absent, it seems to act more like general semantics.
Hi, very enjoyable symposium, thanks. I just wondered whether you considered losing the word semantic. I mean, for years and years, people complained about Endel's use of that. Originally, it was used to refer to aspects of linguistics. And maybe we should be talking about conceptual knowledge, something like that, rather than semantics. I don't know what you think about that. Maybe that would be a step too far. It's your choice.
Yeah, I guess a broader point, and I think you've made this, Louis, in some of your writings, is that there's sort of there's a lot of terminologies, there's a lot of terms that are being used, and one thing that might help move this field forward is narrowing it down to a collection of terms that people seem to be generally comfortable with.
Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much again to all the speakers. Thank you.